All right, so if you're studying urban planning, you've got to know this story. We're going to dive into how post-war America wasn't just built, it was totally designed. We're talking about a country completely reshaped by a few huge ideas and two projects that honestly still define how we live today.
So to really get a grip on just how big this was, we have to start with the problem. I mean, think about it. World War II is over. Millions of GIs are coming home, and they're facing this double whammy of a crisis. First, there's a massive housing shortage. And second, the country's infrastructure, it just wasn't ready for a modern, on-the-move America. And this quote, it just perfectly captures how desperate things were.
So you've got two huge problems. Millions of homes needed, thousands of miles of roads. The solutions they came up with were, well, they were radical. And they could only happen because of this huge philosophical shift in how Americans thought about government's job. And that shift, it actually started a full decade earlier.
Okay, so to really get the big projects of the 1950s, we've got to rewind the clock to the 30s. The Great Depression basically put a huge question on the table for the whole country. Is the government's role just to kind of nudge the economy along, or should it actually grab the wheel and actively shape the nation's future?
And this is where things get really interesting. You see this huge contrast, right? On one side, you have President Hoover. His approach was all about a limited government, guiding things through voluntary cooperation. But then comes FDR and the New Deal. And it's a total 180. It pushes this idea that was pretty revolutionary for America at the time, that the federal government should step in directly and use national planning to fix national-scale problems.
And this wasn't just some academic idea floating around. Nope, it was pushed hard by a group of real visionaries, guys like Frederick Delano and Charles Merriam. These weren't just politicians, they were planners, coming from city and regional planning backgrounds. They looked at the country's mess and basically saw a giant canvas, a chance to apply their ideas on a scale nobody had ever dreamed of. They were really the architects of this whole new mindset.
But let's be clear, this was not a smooth transition. Not at all. The very idea of national planning was super controversial. A lot of people were genuinely scared it was a slippery slope to collectivism. And as you can see from this quote, the opposition in Congress was fierce. They threw everything they had at the New Deal's planning board, accusations of waste, socialism, you name it, until they finally killed it in 1943. But here's the thing. The idea itself, it didn't die. It had already planted its roots.
Okay, so the war ends. How does this new ambition for massive national-scale problem-solving actually turn into stuff? Well, the first explosion happened in the private sector, and it was a direct shot at fixing that housing crisis we talked about. And that brings us to Levittown. You have to understand, this thing, led by William Levitt and his sons, wasn't just another subdivision. You could almost think of it as a factory for building communities. Its whole purpose was to crank out affordable houses for returning GIs and to do it fast.
So how in the world did they do it? That's the key question. The Levitts didn't build houses in the traditional way, one at a time. No, they took a page right out of Henry Ford's book and applied the assembly line to home building. The whole thing was broken down into 27 separate steps, so you'd have specialized crews moving from one concrete slab to the next. One team just did the framing, the next team did the roofing, the next did the painting, over and over.
And the result of all that efficiency? It was just insane. Get this, at their peak in 1948, they were finishing 30 houses a day. Just stop and think about that for a second. 30 houses. That's like an entire block of a neighborhood popping up from nothing in less than a week.
And the demand was just off the charts. I mean, look at these numbers. They start out in 47 planning for 2,000 homes. That's already pretty big. But by the time they wrapped up in 51, they had built more than 17,000 homes. This wasn't just building a town. This was the private sector thinking and acting on the same massive scale as a government planning agency.
So at the exact same time the Levitts are churning out houses, the federal government is turning its attention to that other big problem, infrastructure. And they were about to launch a project that would make even Levittown look small.
It's often called the greatest public works project in history, and for good reason. We're talking about the interstate highway system. This was really the ultimate fulfillment of that New Deal planning idea we talked about, and what's fascinating is that it was finally made real by a Republican president, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
And this right here, this caption from one of the early reports, it just perfectly captures the sheer vision behind the whole thing. They weren't just thinking about pouring concrete for roads. They were literally imagining a brand new high-speed America. An America where you'd have to redesign department store windows because people would be flying by at 60 miles an hour. It's wild.
You know, this idea didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had been bubbling under the surface for decades. It really started way back in 1919, when a young Army officer named Dwight Eisenhower had this miserable experience on a military convoy trying to get across the country. Then, in the 30s, those New Deal planners started drawing up the first real concepts. And finally, in the 50s, that same Eisenhower, now President Eisenhower, made it his mission, arguing it was absolutely essential for national defense and for the economy.
I mean, it is almost impossible to overstate the impact of the interstates. They stitched the country together in a way it never had been before. They supercharged the economy. They created the entire car culture we live in today. Here's a crazy thought. Pretty much every single thing you own, at some point in its journey, has been on an interstate.
Okay, but here's where it gets critical, especially for you as students of planning. The story doesn't just end with, and they built a bunch of cool stuff. We have to take a step back and really look at the long-term legacy of all this. Because, well, these massive projects came with a pretty hefty price tag.
This table really lays out the good and the bad. So, with Levittown, right? The promise was amazing, affordable homes for everyone. But the peril, the downside, was this crushing conformity and, this is crucial, explicit, built-in racial segregation. It became the prototype for suburban sprawl. Then you have the interstates. The promise was unity and mobility. The peril? They often tore right through the heart of cities, contributing to urban decay, killing public transit, and leaving a huge environmental footprint.
And the critiques started coming. And they were fierce. Planners and social critics pointed out that Levittown wasn't just conformist, it was explicitly designed to be for white families only. And the highways, they weren't built in empty fields. They were often intentionally plowed right through existing black and brown neighborhoods, wiping entire communities off the map. And when you put these two things together, what did you get? You got a nation totally dependent on the car, and you got the creation of what one famous critic called the crabgrass frontier of endless suburbia.
So here's the big takeaway. These projects, Levittown and the interstates, were this massive, controversial, but absolutely world-changing experiment. They did so much more than just build houses and roads. They literally engineered the America we live in today, both physically and socially.
And that leaves us with one final big question for you. The generation of the mid-20th century faced their crises, housing, infrastructure, and they met them with a vision that was incredibly bold, even if it was deeply flawed. So, as the next generation of planners, what's the great challenge of our time? And more importantly, what's the radical, bold vision that you're going to build to meet it?